Today's presentation is part of our ongoing programming related to history that's closely related to today's current events. Now, our speaker, Peter Cole, is a professor of history at Western Illinois University in Macomb, my hometown university. He holds a BA from Columbia University and a PhD in history from Georgetown University, and is the founding director of the Chicago Race Riot of 1919 Commemoration Project. He is the author of Dock Worker Power, Race and Activism in Durban and the San Francisco Bay Area, and Wobblies on the Waterfront, Interracial Unionism in Progressive Area, Philadelphia. He co-edited Wobblies of the World, A Global History of the IWW, and edited Ben Fletcher, The Life and Times of a Black Wobbly. In addition to many scholarly articles and book chapters, he's also published dozens of non-academic essays in numerous publications in the United States and abroad. In his spare time, he also is research associate in the Society, Work and Development Institute at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. This morning, as we approach the centennial of the Chicago Race Riot of 1919, Professor Cole will discuss what happened in this largely forgotten event, why it still matters today, and how the Commemoration Project plans to help us not forget. Please welcome Peter Cole.
It is a pleasure to be here, and especially because Steve is what we call in Macomb, Illinois, a Macomie homie. And I am not a Macomie homie. I've only lived there for 19 years, but there's nothing like a hometown, right? So I appreciate that he now lives here and is a part of this, and there's a community of people in Macomb that are part of the Unitarian Fellowship that is not so different, really, than this, and I actually spoke about this project there not that long ago. I'm the founding director of this project because it was my idea and I'm the only one who actually works on it, and so it might sound better than it is. Let me tell you a little about, first, the place that we all live. I actually live in Chicago part-time. It's come to be my practice to sort of acknowledge, that the people who first lived in this area that we call Chicago, in fact, were not white people or people of European descent, but native people, and that the word Chicago actually comes from a native word of people who live in this area, and that was a plant, maybe a wild garlic plant called Chicago that grew along the banks of what we call the Chicago River that used to flow into the Lake Michigan before we reversed flow, right, in the late 19th century, and then literally moved all the crap downstate to the Illinois River and then beyond, right? But that also, not only were the first peoples who live in Chicago not white folks, but also that the first non-native person to live in Chicago was not a white person either. He was of African descent, very possibly originally from Haiti, which then would have been Saint-Domingue, a French colony, right, where the French had basically brought hundreds of thousands of Africans to work sugarcane. And then for reasons that we don't even know, that he moved into what was New France, and then down into what we now call the United States, and settled with and married a local woman of the Potawatomi tribe, and his name is Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, and that's why there is a museum on the south side in Hyde Park called the Du Sable Museum of African American History. It's actually named for the first person who was not a native person who lives in what is now Chicago. Even though Salud, that is not very well known. But it's important to appreciate, right, especially given the subject I'm talking about, that how the white, over time, what becomes the white majority essentially disappears a lot of this history, right? Disappears a lot of this history because it's not convenient. The story that I'm going to tell you about today, and then the imagined hopes of what we might do in the future with this knowledge of this history, is that on a very hot Sunday afternoon, I appreciate it's hard to imagine a very hot day when it's a very cold morning, even though it's officially springtime, right? So as we know, when it's really hot in the summertime, or maybe other times of the year, when it's really hot in the summertime in Chicago, people head towards the lake. It's generally cooler along the water, and some of us even go into the waters. So on that Sunday afternoon, July 27th, lots of people went to the beaches, but the beaches were segregated. Now, in the United States, that word often is associated with the American South as sort of laws that discriminate against black people. and exclude black people. But what is less appreciated is, in fact, that segregation also was widely spread across the United States, not just in the South. Although in Illinois and in Chicago, there were not laws that said blacks cannot go here. In fact, it was widely known that blacks were only allowed to go to certain places in public in Chicago in 1919, including the beaches, right? And so most beaches, when we say segregated, that actually usually means white only, right? Because again, language is coded in ways that sometimes we don't even always know, right? Black folks went to a beach on the south side. One of the beaches that was available to them was at a place called 25th Street. Right, and the numbers in Chicago on the south side, the north side has no numbers, right? Only the south side streets have numbers, the east-west streets. And they go from one further north and then down, right? Like, so if you take the red line and you're heading towards 95th Street, you're heading south, right? We probably know that. 25th Street, which is not too far from where McCormick Place is now, right? Although that wasn't built until the late 50s, right? There were beaches where black folks went, but there were nearby white beaches too. Right? And these black kids who didn't know how to swim very well, because the average American didn't know how to swim, right? Like it was not even taught in U.S. Navy to sailors how to swim, right? Like in that time. These kids go, teenagers, black kids who are friends with each other, to 25th Street, near 25th, to secure a raft that they had placed there and used periodically to swim in Lake Michigan to help them as they swam along, right? They swam southward on this Sunday afternoon towards 29th Street, right? And as they were swimming towards a white-only beach, some white people on the beach, not happy about black people swimming in Lake Michigan, in a white part of Lake Michigan, right, started throwing rocks at these children, right? And at least one of these rocks hit a 17-year-old black boy named Eugene Williams, and he drowned, right, on that afternoon, July 27th, 1919. This photograph is actually from not very long after that, because people started to congregate on the beach. It wasn't clear what had happened. His friends who survived went to find a police officer to point out basically who they believed was the killer. A white man whose name remains unknown to this day. But a white police officer refused to arrest that white man at the charge of these black kids. There's a lot of tensions happening at this moment, large crowds of people, black and white, gathering, including police. And existing racial tensions already were very high. And this was the spark that resulted in what we know as the Chicago Race Riot of 1919, which was the worst incident of racial violence in the history of the city of Chicago. Now, Chicago is a fascinating place, and I'll tell a little about it more today, but it's not my focus. But Chicago was, like many other parts of the United States, a cauldron of racial tensions. And this is the year right after World War I. When Eugene Williams was killed on July 27th, and as Steve noted, that is only 2.5 months from now, right? Like, or April, May, May to June. Yeah, that's right. 2.5 months from now, right? Like 38 people were ultimately killed over the course of about 5 days. Mostly blacks, but also whites, all men. And although the violence originated on what we call the South Side, and much of the violence occurred across the South Side, there was also racial violence in the Loop, on the West Side, and on the North Side, although because most black people, as I'll talk about, lived on the South Side, most of the violence occurred because essentially what happened is that gangs of white males started to attack black random people, right? This was not unique in 1919. Although I'm focusing on 1919 in Chicago, in fact, there were several dozen such riots that happened in the United States in the year 1919 alone, right? There was so much violence happening due to racism that it was nicknamed the Red Summer by a man named James Weldon Johnson, who was an artist as well as an activist. Among other songs he wrote, one called Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is sometimes called the Black National Anthem. After the riots of 1919, as I'll talk about much more in a few minutes, segregation hardened and expanded in the city of Chicago, especially residential segregation, that to this day really impacts the city of Chicago and the nation. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this history, you are not alone. Very, very few people know anything about this story, and very, very few people know the impact, right? And so, although I will talk a little about the events itself, because that's interesting and important. Really, arguably more important is the impact, the legacy, right? And that is also unknown, right, and underappreciated. As a result of my sort of interest in this subject, and for a few other parts of my story that I'll tell you about, I've created this project called the Chicago Race Riot of 1919 Commemoration Project, which isn't a phrase that flows quickly off the tongue, I appreciate. And so I sometimes call it CRR19, at least when I'm writing things down. Yeah, essentially I'm trying to create a group of people, I have started to, who are going to help me commemorate this history so that, well, maybe we learn a thing or two from the past and maybe in the future we can do a little better, right? Why does the riot occur? Well, I ask my students this. I assign them books on the subject. They don't know anything about this either, and a lot of my students are from Chicago and Chicago suburbs. And so basically, African Americans start moving in significant numbers to the city of Chicago only in around 1915, right? Although there was a few black folks in Chicago before that time, a so-called Great Migration occurs during World War I because of a massive labor shortage, right? Millions of men are drafted or volunteered, but actually most did not volunteer. Most were drafted into the U.S. Army in World War I. Meanwhile, the government's spending a lot more money to build basically a war machine, which means the economy is growing. Simultaneously, immigration from Europe plunges, right? Because the war in Europe is essentially, we call it World War I, but really it's a European war. So suddenly, those who had often been hired, including my, say, great-grandmother, to work in a factory before World War I, suddenly that labor supply dwindles, right? And so you have this massive demand for labor and a huge shortage for labor. And that is why African Americans get hired. African Americans could have been hired for these jobs 50 years earlier, but they weren't because white employers generally refused to hire black people, right? Even though they spoke English, even though they were citizens, even though they were capable, employers all across America, including in Chicago, would prefer to hire Greeks and Poles and Irish and Czechs and insert European immigrant group here, right? Because of, therefore, the labor shortage, a huge number of blacks start moving into industrial cities, right, across the really Midwest and Northeast, including but not limited to Chicago. These images are sort of famous. A black man named Jacob Lawrence, a painter, created what's called the Migration series. This is one of a series of 50 panels, actually, that he painted, I can't remember, in the 60s, maybe. And then the photograph, actually, on the left is also famous, embodying this sort of migration story of a rural southern black family moving into an urban northern place, but actually to Chicago. This family is headed to Chicago. Where black people end up in Chicago, well, blacks actually did not live only in one part of the city of Chicago, say in 1915. However, many blacks did live in an area that white people referred to as the Black Belt, right? That white people called the Black Belt. And that was on the south side of Chicago. And once basically a neighborhood or neighborhoods are set up, what we call chain migration now follows, right? People of that same ethnic group follow along. It makes perfect sense. We see it in our contemporary metropolitan area too, right? Where certain neighborhoods take on a flavor of an ethnic group based on earlier residents who end up there, often for random reasons. But nevertheless, that grows. Combined with essentially pressure against black people in Chicago, which limited their options, right? So they were often not welcome in many parts of town. And many, therefore, Southern blacks who are overwhelmingly rural, right? And so it's really also, we should understand this as a rural to urban, not just a sort of a southern to northern migration, end up in a neighborhood that increasingly takes on a flavor of being essentially a southern black community. And although the term is not used then, the term we often use now to describe this area, to name this area, is called Bronzeville, right? That term would not have been used in 1919. But nevertheless, over time, now Salud is also considered to be sort of Bronzeville, right? Although that's only one part, and really the sort of the streets, the borders of this area are sort of not fixed. But nevertheless, Bronzeville becomes this destination where tens of thousands of African Americans move into, right? And bring with them this sort of a culture that really vitalizes or creates a lot of energy in this neighborhood and becomes known as the Black Renaissance of Chicago. Now, I know a lot of people have heard of actually the Harlem Renaissance, but actually the Chicago Renaissance, there's a parallel going on simultaneously, because not all the great black artists end up in New York City. In fact, many end up in Chicago, right? And not just in the 19-teens and 20s, but beyond, this neighborhood becomes a sort of a cultural capital, right? Gwendolyn Brooks, pictured here, actually at WIU, our Black Studies Center is named after Gwendolyn Brooks, goes back to 1970. Gwendolyn Brooks lived in Bronzeville. She wrote a lot of poetry about Bronzeville, but Mahalia Jackson lived in Bronzeville. Rosetta Tharpe lived in Bronzeville. Louis Armstrong lived in Bronzeville. Jack Johnson, the boxer, lived in Bronzeville, right? As well as many black businesses. It becomes this very vibrant community, right? Later, Quincy Jones lives in Bronzeville. It's sort of amazing, right, to think about all the talent, right, that exists in this place. However, a lot of white people in Chicago, and I would include European immigrants in that, are unhappy about the growing population of black people in the city of Chicago. And this is a parallel to what's happening in many other places simultaneously. And so what we see is essentially rising racism in this time, rising racism, right? So the film Birth of a Nation, which you can watch on YouTube free, yeah, it's a 3-hour silent film, so it's not a popular, but it was the most popular film for decades. This is the era of silent film. So when this movie is released by the director D.W. Griffith in 1915, there is no popular film for a generation, right? It's still shown in theaters in the 30s, right? And it is a racist film. Yeah? It celebrates the Klan as saving Southern whites from black people who want to basically rape and live with white women, right? Black men. It's sort of it's not subtle, right? And of course, it's based on a play called The Klansman, right? And so this film celebrates the Klan of the 1870s and 80s. And some people who watched this film in 1915 said, "This is great. We really need the Klan again." And so the Klan actually had disappeared for a generation, right? But it is reborn in 1915, right? But although it's no longer a Southern organization, it becomes a national one, because although Chicago may not have many black folks yet, well, there's a lot of Polish people, right? And a lot of Jewish people. And the Klan is basically Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? And so Protestant whites who were unhappy, including a man named Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, who says this is the best film he's ever seen when he screens it at the White House, right? And so what we have is a time of a rising white nationalism, right? And as a result of this, we see rising white violence against black people. Now, I know it's Sunday morning, and I apologize, right? But you know, there's no time to sort of ignore the reality of sort of white supremacy in America, and that includes a spike in racial violence, including killings of arbitrary black men, not just killings, but really sort of brutality. We often call these lynchings in Chicago, but across the country in 1919. Right? And so remember that Chicago 1919 is part of a surge in violence against black people that was happening at this time. And although there's a lot of different reasons why, right, as well as the specific, you know, the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back is Eugene Williams getting killed. But most murders don't result in race riots, right? And so that is the spark, but it doesn't explain why it is that suddenly lots of other people got involved in violence for a week, right? Because murders happen every day, unfortunately, but they don't result in sort of mass violence, right? So there's a lot of different factors. A lot of us think about money, right? I think about money as sort of a source of tension, right? And so there is definitely some competition for jobs happening, including in the stockyards, which at that time was the largest industry in Chicago. It is hard to imagine now because there's no really stockyard work in Chicago. But upwards of 100,000 people worked in Chicago in the stockyards, right? Large parts of the south side and southwest side were 10 square miles were factories dedicated to killing animals to eat them, right? And these live animals came in on trains from the further west, right? And so there was every day thousands of live cattle and hogs, especially, were brought into the city of Chicago, where they were walked into the factories where they were slaughtered, right? And all this work stinks, right? And so who did it? Well, immigrants and black people, right? That's the same as today, right? And so we're mindful of that. This image on the right is interesting. I don't have a pointer, but It's sort of confusing because it sort of turns. It's not looking northward. It's looking sort of westward. It's the top of that image. But the key is that many black people actually had to cross through white neighborhoods to get to the stockyards, right? And so it was a part of your daily routine if you were African American working in the yards that you would have to cross through often hostile neighborhoods in order to get your job or return home from work. I think personally, and I think many people would agree with me who've studied it, that actually neighborhood issues and housing actually are a greater source of tension. And so as the black population increases so much, and a previous slide I think noted that the population of Chicago, of blacks population in Chicago doubled in the space of 5 years from 50,000 to 100,000. But that was still under 4% of the total population of the city, right? Like that blacks started to basically push outward of the black belt because there was not enough housing to go around, right? Like of course what happens often is landlords, owners start dividing up properties into smaller units, charging more. Actually, black people literally paid more per square foot for rent than white people, even though they were often getting far inferior product, right? Like, and so blacks, not like any other group, surprisingly, would try to seek better housing at a cheaper price elsewhere, right? Like when they moved into what had been previously all-white neighborhoods, they often experienced violence, right? This is prior to July 27, 1919. In fact, there was at least 58 documented bombings of black properties in the city of Chicago in the 2.5 years leading up to July 27th. And not a single one of those bombers was arrested and prosecuted by the Chicago police, right? And so if you're thinking about what's it like to be a black person in Chicago in 1919, you should know that there is no protection, right? That it's in a way no different than the South, right? That white people can literally kill you, as they did a black girl in the house pictured here, right? And that no one is punished, right? Like, and so, of course, it's a clear signal also for black people to stay in the black belt, right? Like, and so it's really, this is replicated in the rise of 1919. The most well-known black person who suffered from this was a young man named Langston Hughes, a poet who was a college student during World War I, and when he visited Chicago for the summer in 1918, the year prior, he visited Chicago. He was staying in Bronzeville. He took a walk, right, and he walked westward, right? He crossed what was Wentworth Avenue, which is a north-south street that parallels the Dan Ryan Expressway, but the Dan Ryan didn't exist yet, right, and got beaten up. Right? He got beaten up for being in a white place, right? Like, and so, welcome to Chicago, Langston Hughes, right? He writes about it in his memoir. But his experience, of course, was not uncommon, right? It gives us an example of basically the violence that was sort of ever present, and that although what Langston experienced by himself prior to the riot, during July 1919, August 1919, what happened in Chicago, and which had happened dozens of other times in other places, was so-called race riots. Now, when we use that term, we might think different things, right? And actually, terms change over time in meaning, right? And so historically, what a race riot means in America is groups of whites killing random black people, right? Nowadays, some people, when they hear that term, think black people and arson, right? The same term used, very different perceptions of what that term means, right? Like, but when I use the term race riot, what I mean is, and what it always was used to describe as, prior really to the 1960s, was random groups of whites attacking random groups of blacks, right? Like, including in the Chicago Race Riot. And many of these were gangs, and that term also means different things to different people. But there were gangs, sometimes called athletic clubs, that existed in Chicago in the 19-teens. A young boy named Richard Daley was a member of the Hamburg Athletic Club, which was associated with the Democratic Party in his ward, right? And these gangs basically enforced voting power, right? Like, so how did the so-called machine take power? They literally took power because they had enforcers, young white guys, who basically intimidated people to vote for the right party, the right candidates. And so these gangs were also central to what happened in July 1919, because who is organized, if you will, to sort of start attacking random black people at this moment? It was these gangs. Now, there's no direct evidence that Richard Daley participated in the 1919 riots, although the Hamburg Athletic Club, of which he was a part, was implicated, right? And he never talked about it to his dying day. But you know, what's also interesting about the 1919 riot, and soon I'll pivot to talking about like what I'm trying to do with it, right, is that black people fought back. This is actually about the first time that in a race riot, not all of the victims were black. Right? 15 of the 38 people killed were white. Right? Now, some of those people, in fact, were random white victims of random black retaliation. Right? Some of those whites were actually people who wanted to kill black people, but were killed by blacks in self-defense, right? And we actually have a decent bit of information on many of these people, although sometimes it's a little tricky. Claude McKay, a Jamaican who lived in New York City, wrote a famous poem, "At this exact moment, if we must die, let us die fighting back." Right? So that explains a new Negro, as it was referred at the time, militancy on the part of blacks, willing to basically do what previous generations of black had not done, which is essentially, now you might associate this with, I don't know, the Black Panthers or Malcolm X, but it's the exact same concept, right? 50 years prior, right? Which is also very interesting. And many of these people who are fighting back literally had just come back for fighting from the United States in France, were decorated veterans of World War I, right? Who the French actually decorated, who were reformed an all-black unit, the Illinois 8th, in Bronzeville on 35th Street and Michigan Avenue. There's now a statue dedicated to this unit, right, that fought in World War I, right? It's actually a central place in this neighborhood. Now, after the riot, the question was, what the hell happened, right? I just explained to you a little what happened. There was actually a book that was compiled, a report, which many of us, myself included, looked to as essentially the Bible of the story. And you can download this actually online if you wish, as a large file, The Negro in Chicago, written primarily by the black man on the left, Charles Johnson, who had a PhD in sociology. But although there was, at the moment, some sort of going, geez, what happened? The truth is that quickly, the city forgot what went on, right? Now, also what's happening is, simply put, rising racism in the 1920s. Now, violence is unattractive for many reasons and looks bad for the city, bad for business, right? Like, there's actually much more simple, safer, less violent ways to achieve the same goal, which is containing black people, right? Like, so that they cannot live in white neighborhoods. Restrictive covenants, a term we no longer really think much about because it no longer exists legally, essentially was if you bought property in your deed, also called a covenant, right? Like Abraham and God signing a covenant, a contract, right? Like, you know, that you can put restrictions on this deed, and a lot of deeds basically had restrictions on who you could sell, lease, or allow to live in this property if you buy it, and that includes restrictions on black people. This is not unique to Chicago. Around the country in the 20s and 30s, there was millions of properties, including in Macomb, that had sort of restrictive covenants placed in them. Chicago was one of the places, Salud, where this was very common in the 1920s, where there was a huge growth in housing. So why does this matter? Right after the 1919 riots, there's this construction boom, and a lot of these areas right around the Black Belt have these restrictive covenants placed in them that make it basically ever harder for blacks to move into these other neighborhoods, right? So you could use violence, like we saw in July 1919, or you could use these restrictive covenants. Both have the same effect, right? Now, there's other ways also the United States and the city of Chicago have done this. Roads, right, are one of them, right? Like, so the Dan Ryan Expressway was built in the late 50s, right? That is a 10-lane highway that's basically a wall, right? And where it's constructed is not coincidence. It's just to the east, yeah, of where the White Sox play, right, in that neighborhood. That's Richard Daley's neighborhood, right? That's Bridgeport, right? That was an Irish-American predominant neighborhood, right? And to the east of the highway is Bronzeville, right? And so you could use, again, violence, or you could use federal dollars, which we all pay, right, in our taxes to do, in order to segregate, right? Like, and again, this is not in Chicago, but it's actually a very sort of prominent. Now, the older folks in this room might also remember the Robert Taylor homes, which stretched for 2.5 miles, a series of like 28 16-story high-rises that were almost entirely all black public housing, right, that came associated. Again, there's not enough housing in Bronzeville. Most neighborhoods, including suburbs in the city, middle-class neighborhoods, refuse to allow public housing, essentially NIMBYs, right? And so poor neighborhoods would be where the only places that public housing was built because they were the only neighborhoods that didn't have the political clout to prevent that, right? Like, and so poverty, but also racialized poverty, becomes ever more concentrated in Chicago, right? And we see that, of course, to this day. So again, this is not only because of the 1919 riot, but it's contributed to by it, right? The map on this here is confusing. Read it from right to left, not left to right, in terms of chronology, right? And if we look at the far north side, which we might be interested most in, from 1970, we do actually see the racial demographics of really Rogers Park, of Uptown and Edgewater changing, right? In particular, as far as the north side goes, it's the only neighborhoods that changed drastically in the last generation or so in terms of demographics. That's worth knowing, right? But if we don't believe the words coming out of my mouth, I always say take the red line, right? And ride it from Howard down to 95th and or back, and you'll see, as I do, because I ride the rails, like the racial demographics change dramatically. In the last year especially, I've spent a lot of time on the South Side trying to develop this project. I'm often the only white person when I'm on the train or the bus, walking down the streets in different neighborhoods as I've tried to do research and sort of form the talk I'm doing here I've given to other groups of people predominantly on the South Side, right? They're unfamiliar with this history too, but they don't have to be told that segregation is still very alive and well, right? I don't have to tell it here either. Of course, we also see other methods of how racism persists, including, ironically, police essentially enforcing segregation and police enforcing white supremacy, right? Whether it's the West Side killing of Fred Hampton in 1969 when a Black Panther leader was drugged asleep when the Chicago police invade his apartment and open fire with dozens of bullets that kill him and one other member who was asleep at the time, right? Or whether it was Laquan McDonald 5 years ago who was killed, as we've seen the video if we have, where face down on the ground with his hands behind his back, 16 shots are put into his body, right? I should not have to tell, but I always want to highlight how sort of persistent these problems are, right? It's not a thing of the past, right? Now, why is it? I would say, of course, as a historian, that it's partially due to our collective amnesia, right? That the failure to sort of confront the past does not result in sort of a racially harmonious present. If what I said since the riot didn't exist, right? If in fact there was racial harmony and racial justice over the last century, we wouldn't need to know that much about the riot. But because, in fact, racism persists and sort of the inequality persists, right? We might ask ourselves, what have we done wrong and what can we do different in the future, right? Now, for white people like myself, it might be easier to try to forget, to try to deny, try to ignore this history. Not everyone is as fortunate. I use the metaphor of a splinter, right? If, I don't know, a splinter gets into my chest somehow and I don't remove it, it doesn't go away, right? It just goes deeper and deeper into my body and actually over time worsens, right? It doesn't just get better. It in fact often worsens. And so I sort of use that metaphor as an example of where we are as a society in 2019. How come once more we're in a time of racial sort of tensions? It's because we have yet to sort of grapple with and accept the history, right, of racial violence that persists to this day in our city and our country as well as our world, right? Now, simultaneously, we also know that, in fact, there is rising racial tensions because, A, there's actually fear of change, but also sort of people pushing for change, right? And so it is not either or, it is both, yeah? And so we're also in a moment where in the last 5 years or 6 years, 7 years, and I would guess for the foreseeable future, we're seeing a lot of Black and other people of color pushing for greater acceptance, greater equality, justice, right? And we see many white allies with them as well, right? One sort of issue that comes to mind to me and sort of to others maybe is changing the names of buildings, parks, and whatnot that are that honored Confederate generals and Confederate leaders, or removing statues of and monuments to Confederate leaders in particular. The first time I went to Memphis, Tennessee, I was in this beautiful park, and then I noticed it was named after Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a slave trader, then was a Confederate general who was the general during what was called the Fort Pillow Massacre, in which several hundred Union soldiers refused to be accepted for surrendering, and they just executed several hundred Black soldiers, right? And of course, then later became the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, right? And so, in the state of Tennessee, his home state, there are still numerous things named after Nathan Bedford Forrest, right? Forget about Jefferson Davis, right? We're talking about Forrest is sort of the worst of the worst. Robert E. Lee, too, right, in New Orleans, famously, a circle that was named after him and a statue on the top of this tall pillar were removed. These places, not coincidentally, are Black majority places. Right? So let us remember that where Black people have now had the political power to change things, they are starting to change things. In white majority states like Tennessee and Louisiana, there's problems at the state level, but in cities where Blacks have the political power, they have actually started to push for these sorts of changing. That's not surprising. So too in Montgomery, Alabama, where a Black man named Brian Stevenson has led this program called the Equal Justice Initiative, which among other projects has created this museum that's often now nicknamed the Lynching Museum, which exists in Montgomery, which is supposedly the most amazing, powerful place in the United States now to sort of grapple with the history of racial violence. I sort of see this project I'm trying to do in that light. Here in Chicago, of course, what do we have? Ida B. Wells, a famous black activist who lived for decades in Chicago, just had a major street renamed after her. First time a woman or a black person has been honored like this in the Loop in Chicago, in the center of our city. And we also know that there's a lot of activism happening in Chicago and greater Chicago on race, right? The recent election of a black woman is sort of one example of this sort of changes that we are perhaps seeing. Now, you might have heard of the Newberry Library. I'm not the only one who thinks about 1919. The Newberry Library actually has a wonderful series of projects, programs happening this calendar year that I encourage you to go to a website called chicago1919.org, and they have their next event is May 4th. There's actually also some wonderful books that are on this subject that are new. The one on the right is already in print by a woman from Chicago named Claire Hartfield. It's a young adult history of the 1919 riots. And so if you have children in your life, you might give them this book. In the next month, a book of poetry on the left is coming out by a Chicagoan named Eve Ewing, who's sort of a new lion, but that should be wonderful. I've already seen her perform some of her poems from this book, but not yet released to you. What am I trying to do? In Chicago, on the left, that little stone with a little plaque on it, which you cannot read, is the only acknowledgement of what happened in 1919 that I've spent 30 minutes telling you about, right? That was created by a suburban high school class about 10 years ago that took a little initiative, which is great, but nevertheless, Chicago literally has done nothing. And this year, the centennial, Chicago is doing nothing, right? In the city of Chicago, has that's typical, right? Again, rather forget or deny or ignore or not even know about than sort of do something. Now, by contrast, in Germany, where I happen to have spent a lot of time, they are doing much better, in my opinion, about dealing with their history of the Holocaust, right? So if you're walking down the street in Washington, D.C. between the White House and the Capitol and you see the huge monument to slavery, then you've just entered a time machine and went into the future, right? The United States has never acknowledged its history of racism and slavery, period, right? By contrast, in Germany, right near its Capitol building, there is a multi-acre monument to the murdered Jews of Europe, right? The picture on the right. It's only an example. There's actually many examples across the country of Germany, in cities across the country, state, local, and national initiatives, as well as private ones, to sort of grapple with the history of the Holocaust. The one example that I am talking about now is called Stolpersteine. I don't speak German, but that means basically stumbling stones. And I've got one, so I'll pass it around. I should have passed it around already. It's heavy, but you're not going to break it, so feel free to sort of grab it and pass it around. So in the 1990s, a German artist named Günter Demnig installed 20 of these in a neighborhood in Berlin, outside of the houses of Holocaust victims, so that when you're walking down the street in Berlin, now other places, you will just stumble across, not literally trip, but metaphorically, right, a reminder that here lived a Holocaust victim. Basically, it says, here lived John Smith, born 1900, died Auschwitz 1944, right? That's all, right? But it's a subtle yet powerful reminder of the history of this place, and that instantly connects past and present in a way that otherwise unite. So you're walking down the street, you're thinking about your own world, your own life, what you got to do that day, what you're going to watch Game of Thrones later, and then you are reminded that the Holocaust happened. And it didn't just happen somewhere else, it actually happened where I live. It happened in my neighborhood, on my street, right? And so Günter Demnig has been incredibly successful at this, and now there's over 75,000 of these across Germany and 23 other countries in Europe, and more every year, thousands in the queue, right? So that not every one will ever be marked, but nevertheless, it's an incredible example of what is possible through public art, right? And so what I am saying here is that we could do something like this in Chicago, rather than at their last known residence that installed 38 markers. They will be different than the ones that are going around the room now, but inspired by, right? Geographically dispersed at the locations where 38 people were killed in July and August of 1919. so that you are reminded, right, of the history of this place. And it might result in you sort of learning something. It also might result in you trying to do something different, right? Like to be someone different, to have a conversation that might be difficult to have otherwise, to sort of acknowledge sort of past atrocities, but also the persistent legacy of this. You know, if that vision sounds exciting to you, well, it sounds exciting to me. I've spent the last year trying to figure out how to make this a reality. I've built a group of 15 or 20 people who I call a working group. Other folks like me, educators, including universities throughout, well, Northwestern and U of C and UIC and Columbia College, the Chicago Teachers Union, so that we can start to teach this in public schools, although actually some teachers do teach this history, right, although we could do much more, right, that we need to raise money to sort of make this a reality, hire a real artist who has work in metals and public art, what that artist will do that makes it unique, different than what you are seeing passed around. I don't know yet, I'm not an artist. But like, you know, so it will be geographically dispersed in public art to acknowledge sort of racial atrocities, but different in many possible ways. We will eventually have a website. We technically have one right now, but like you can't see it. We have a Twitter account, right? Like, and on July 27th, the exact 100th anniversary of the 1919 riots, we will have a public event in Bronzeville, the neighborhood where this violence began, right, at the Illinois Institute of Technology on 33rd and State, and then walk several blocks to 35th Street, where 4 people were killed on the second night of the riot, 4 black men. And although we probably won't have the markers installed yet, because it's too quick to make possible happen, and we don't yet have any money, but like, you know, where we will do a public event. We actually have won one grant from the Illinois Humanities Council, which will probably fund our website. And then we've advanced to sort of the final round of a grant from the Field Foundation of Chicago, which would give us enough money to get started, although we intend to crowdfund as well. But this July 27th launch will happen. We'll have an hour-long program approximately, and then maybe a trolley tour around the neighborhood for those who wish to sort of do more. This ideally was going to be done by July 27, 2019, that we would have had 38 of these installed, located, et cetera, et cetera. That was too much too soon, right? Like I started planning this last spring, right? Like, so I've been working on this about a year. But it doesn't matter if as long as we have a public launch on that day, what will happen? Well, in 2040, it doesn't matter if we've installed everything by 2019. So we will basically progressively roll out markers in 2019, 2020, 2021, as long as it takes to make 38 happen. We, of course, have to work with the city, and we've already had one meeting with the city, but more planned. And then we could do more. I am inspired what they've done in Germany, and that's spread to across 23 other countries in Europe. There are many other examples of racial atrocities in the history of the United States where you could have similar sort of projects develop, right? And so it's easy to imagine a flourishing future of this project, even though we haven't yet achieved our goals here, right? Like, but nevertheless, I am hopeful because I'm a hopeful person, and because I think this project is so interesting. By itself, obviously, this project is not going to solve our racial tensions, create racial justice in our country, obviously not. But of course, not acknowledging and sort of discussing the history of racism in America has also not created that, right? And so what we can see is that perhaps this project can be part of a larger trend in our country to try to make essentially the 21st century much better than the 20th and 19th and 18th and 17th and 16th centuries were, right? In terms of how we deal with difference. Yeah. So I thank you for your attention, yeah, that's all.
Thank you. Wow. How in the world did you get into this? What happened in your life or a class or a person or whatever that inspired you to take this on?
Well, I guess there's a short and a long version, but I've been teaching subjects of this sort for over 20 years. Actually, I finished my PhD in 1997. You know, I originally got interested in the history of American race relations because of a really instructor in college, right, who wasn't the first person to come up with this idea, but nevertheless was the first that really sort of introduced it to me, that the central paradox of American history is race, right? How could a country but I was taken, right? Now I also happen to be Jewish American, although I am not practicing in any way whatsoever. But like, I couldn't help but be sort of blown away by the huge amounts of Holocaust memorials, museums, monuments, and markers in this country called Germany. And so I just started to sort of check out more of these locations. But this public art project called Stolpersteine, which is not government funded, public because it's in the public space, right? Like, was deeply impressive to me and many other people, right? Like, and so I started to think about it. I wrote an article in the Washington Post about a year and a half ago, less than a year and a half ago, on Stolpersteine, but also how we could do that here. And then I started thinking about what could I do here? Well, I lived in Illinois for 19 years, and I teach about 1919 riot. And I know my students don't know anything about it because I've taught the subject for a long time. And I don't hate on young people or students. Their parents don't know anything either, right? Like, they're the ones who have failed to teach them, right? Like, and so when I was thinking about, well, could we really do this? Well, it's still not clear if we will succeed in our objective. But like, that was sort of how I sort of came to this, right? Like, I've never done a public art project before. I'm not trained in it, and I'm not an artist, but it seemed like a good idea, and no one else was doing it.
Thank you very much. Can you give us the name of the website and also the title of your book that you just published?
Well, of course. So our website, I registered the domain is ChicagoRaceRiot.org, but there's nothing there yet, right? The Newberry Library has a great website called Chicago 1919, similar but different, where there's some history, there's some information on their events, and in the future we'll do more. We have a Twitter account, it's our only public face, right, at the moment, and Chicago Race Riot.
The lavalier not working so well.
Oh, sorry, ChicagoRaceRiot.org and Chicago Race Riot if you do Twitter. My book is called Dock Worker Power, Dock Worker Power. Theoretically, that's a really excellent title. That it really, I studied dock workers in Durban and San Francisco who were union, collective organized workers who basically fought for racial equality. So guess what? All this stuff I do is related to the subjects. But like, that's an example of going back to how do we change things. Groups of ordinary people who organize to change things, right? Like, we call them social movements. The greatest social movements in American and world history are unions because they are more powerful than most other groups. We have more power at work than we do at the ballot box, I'd say. And so unions occasionally have fought for racial equality, and I've written a lot about that subject. This is another sort of aspect of my same, if you will, sort of intellectual journey, I guess. Sort of try to sort of make things a little better. Teaching, right, of course, is my primary duty.
Thank you.
Fascinating subject. This is also the 100th anniversary of the 1919 Black Sox scandal, and I don't think the White Sox are playing any kind of commemoration either. But 1921, there was a terrible riot in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Have you studied that?
I know about it. I could tell you about it, but I have not actively studied nor written about it. But like, I appreciate your more people died in Tulsa, like 8 times more people say than in Chicago in 1919. There are so many different examples of mass violence against African Americans and other people of color in American history. It sort of boggles the mind, right? But the Tulsa one was particularly horrible because it was particularly large and it was targeting a successful black neighborhood, the sort of a black Wall Street, as it was nicknamed. There was a black Wall Street in Chicago. State Street, basically, in the 30s was where there were dozens of black-owned businesses in this era. The violence in 1919 didn't target these businesses, but nevertheless, it's also what's happening in Tulsa, what's happening in black communities across the country, rarely, like because of pervasive racism. black-owned businesses catered to black customers, and although individually blacks might not have much money, collectively they did, right? And so in fact, in some ways, segregated Chicago offered more business opportunities to black Chicagoans than, ironically, the post-segregation era, right? Like, so if you walk around state today, in the 30s, you will not see as vibrant a business community as you did then. Nor will you in Tulsa, because it was wiped off the map, right? Like, and it was never rebuilt in Tulsa, right? And in Tulsa, there are people who are mindful of this history, even though I have never done any sort of formal investigations, but I'm familiar with it. But I appreciate your knowledge of it. In 1919, in Arkansas, actually, was the largest violence. 300 approximately black people were killed, sharecroppers, for trying to organize a sharecroppers union in the Arkansas Delta, right? Like, yeah.
Hi, this was very interesting, lots of information, thank you. I'm wondering what kind of art you're looking for your project. Like, is it mostly like metal and plaques and sculpture, or are you looking for like maybe murals? Because I have a painter in mind.
The answer is yes. So I love street art, and if you've spent time in Berlin, Berlin has a great street art scene, including a lot of murals on buildings, both legal and illegal. So Chicago also does, right? Like, and I very much appreciate Chicago murals in various parts of our city. And so the primary art will be something that will likely be embedded in the ground, sort of non-obtrusive, and also as opposed to a statue, say, with some information, and then also very possibly, say, signage very close by that will direct pedestrians to find out more information, right? Like, say, to a website, right? So that when we all take out our phones and we go, what the hell is this? That we'll be able to find something. And on Google Maps, because some of our team members are really sort of maps, GIS people, so that, like, on Google Maps, you'll be able to find all 38 locations with information on the individuals, although very unlikely we'll have images, because we don't actually have, we know lots about we know some about everyone who was killed, but not, say, a photograph, right? Now, could you have other types of art in the vicinity of these locations, or at least some of them? The answer is of course, right? And I very much, and some of us also, several people on the project are curators. They're not artists, but they work in arts. So that's on our agenda. You know, everything is a great idea and it takes money. I want multiple artists involved, not just one, right? And it's not just up to me, say, but nevertheless, like, so the primary objects will be very likely stainless steel or other durable metal. The one you saw around here is actually brass, and brass is not as durable. And so if they could go back in time, I've spoken to the sculptor, is not the original artist, but the guy who actually does 6 days a week, creating the inscriptions. He's like, I would use stainless steel, not brass, if I were you, right? Like, so it'll probably be metal because of durability. Look at the weather in April that we have here in Chicago, right? Like, but we could very much have other types, and maybe at the launch, and maybe at some of the other installations as they periodically happen, we could also have, you know, like poets or singers, right? Like, the creativity hopefully will flourish as we get more people aware, because very few people are aware of this project yet, and that's why I do these events, right? Like, to sort of spread the word, and then someone says, hey, I've got an artist, right? Like, so I very much would love that information, but different locations will maybe offer different opportunities, we'll say. I've visited some of the sites, but I've not visited all of the sites yet. Everything's changed, right? 100 years, right? So 35th and Wabash, there's actually no Wabash at 35th anymore. It cuts at 34th and starts up again at 37th. So I know where 35th and Wabash was, but actually right now there's no intersection at that particular place where 4 people were killed on July 28th, 1919. So we have to adapt, right? Like, that one happens to be near a school. De La Salle is sort of a well-known Catholic school right in that neighborhood. And so could we, for instance, do a mural on the side of De La Salle's building? I'd love that. I have some people who are alums of De La Salle who might eventually get us something of that sort, although that's maybe longer term. And then we want to pay all our artists, right? Like, so we're trying to raise money so that we can sort of not ask people to work for free. I'm working for free, but like, I have a salary, right? Like, and so, but we definitely want to pay our artists, right? Like, that's central to our vision. Ideally, artists from the neighborhoods that we work, but more generally, artists who really are committed to this vision, right? Like, that's most important. So afterwards, I'd love to get the name of a suggestion. Yeah.
It's a wonderful talk. I was curious to know who the we is. Can you tell us a little bit about the leadership of the core, how you want to expand the leadership in deciding who, where things go?
Right, the we is me, sort of imagining a future we, right? So there is a group of us who periodically talk, right? And so I started to recruit people who I knew last summer, right? So some people in this neighborhood called Bronzeville, where I had a former student who now runs this thing called the Bronzeville Historical Society, a small nonprofit, educators at various levels, but especially at University of Chicago and UIC, who are professors of history and African American studies, that sort of thing. Like I said, the CTU, I'm in faculty union, American Federation of Teachers. I reached out to my sister union, the Chicago Teachers Union, and to get teachers on board, right? If you know the Chicago Public Schools, there's actually these community action councils that exist in different neighborhoods to sort of promote education, but also sort of after-school programs. And so the Bronzeville Community Action Council is a partner, right? Like I've reached out to various different religious groups with so far very limited success, but there's one, for instance, Lutheran Church in Hyde Park that's excited about the project. And I continue to ask for more. I'll do one-on-ones or meetings or presentations with anyone, but I see education as a central focus, right, in addition to the art. And so those are the sorts of people who I've focused on. We don't yet exist as a 501c3. Yeah, so right now, the School of Art and Art History at UIC is our fiscal agent, right, for instance. And several people who work in that school who direct museum studies and whatnot are some of the team members, right? And so those are the sorts. I'm happy to share names if you wish, right? But I mean, we haven't done any media outreach yet. But and then, another institution is IIT, right? They're our host, right? That's the public university in the neighborhood, very close to somewhere a lot of the violence occurred, and so that's why our event is going to happen at the Student Union Auditorium at IIT on that morning of July 27th. And so I've been trying to sort of build, but the truth is, we is me more often than not, right? Although hopefully if we raise enough money, if we get this grant, I might be able to hire a part-time assistant, right? Maybe a student, a grad student or something.
Hello, Professor. Nice, very good talk.
Thanks.
I'm just sort of thinking, I finished a book yesterday, The City of Scoundrels by Gary Christ. And I found it as a really easy narrative read, really accessible, which gave the story of the 12 days in July, including the race riot. And it also talked a little bit about urban politics. Our first big city boss, I think Mayor Bill Thompson from the Republican Party, and the governor, Governor Landon, who was a big prominent politician in the 1920s. Instead of rambling, I'm just giving that little bit of info. There's a good narrative history called The City of Scoundrels by Gary Christ. If anyone's interested in some context, I toss it out. I imagine you read it, right, Professor?
No.
Oh.
I know the book.
You may
I
wanna
have a
check it
copy
out.
of it. I have a copy of the book. I hear it's very good. I've got a list of books to read too. But I've heard it's excellent. I own a copy. It is supposedly very good. I recommend this book by Claire Hartfield, even though it's written for young adults. Actually, young adults don't want to be talked down to, so the book is quite accessible to non-young adults. There's also this book by William Tuttle called Race Riot, which is really sort of considered the best scholarly history of 1919, but I appreciate that this guy is a successful author who's done a great job of presenting the story and a few other related events from these 12 days, as this gentleman said in 1919, related, I think, to the baseball, what was going on, as well as what this child who was missing or something like that, right? And so Chicago, a lot of things are going on, right? Not just the riots, although the riot was probably the single most important event that was happening in that moment in time in this place. Carl Sandburg, the poet and artist. He also actually has there's a slim volume of some of his writings from 1919 because he was a reporter in Chicago at that time. And one of the few really whites in Chicago who was writing sympathetically about the Negro question. And so there's actually a number of really good, but I've heard that gentleman's book is really good.
In one of your earlier newspaper pictures in the series, this is the one where a couple of cops are with a riot victim who was down.
Yeah.
It looked like to me at least, that the cop in the foreground of that picture might have been black. Were there any significant number of black cops in Chicago at that time?
So that's a great question. So there's actually very few photographs of the 1919 riot. So if you were to spend a little time online and start poking around, you'll find the same images again and again. I'm as guilty as anyone of recycling the same handful of images that the Chicago History Museum really sort of is the keeper of them these days. Their photography was actually quite common in this time, right? Like there were already cheap handheld cameras, especially by Kodak, right? Like that had sort of made them quite accessible to ordinary people, not even middle class, but even working class people might. So it's always shocking to me how few really great images there are of 1919, given how long and wide and how many people actually would have had cameras in Chicago in that time, right? It's sort of unfortunate. To your question, there were black police officers in Chicago at that time. There was very few, but there were some, right? Coincidentally, I don't think ironically, the only police officer killed in 1919 was a black police officer, right? And so if we're thinking about the racial politics of 2019, not 1919, sometimes the Chicago police has been seen as an enemy of race relations and of the black community, and sometimes doesn't want to sort of acknowledge what it has done to different communities. If I'm thinking about the Haymarket riots of 1886, and there's now a statue on Des Plaines and Randolph in the West Loop to the Haymarket tragedy when 16 people were killed, including 8 police. The police didn't want that, right? Like they fought for decades against a statue that ultimately now stands, right? We haven't yet had a meeting with the police, but like that one of the 38 we will commemorate. I don't say honor intentionally, I say commemorate. That difference may be lost on a lot of people, but I try to emphasize it. We will be commemorating a police officer because a police officer was killed, and that happened to be a black police officer, right? Now, some of the people who were killed by the police. Black people were killed by the police. No white people were killed by the police in 1919, but nevertheless, we have, if you will, a black police officer of our 38, and we are hoping that the Chicago Police Department, therefore, is sympathetic to our initiative. And I should also say that, in case you're unaware, on 35th Street is where, in fact, the Chicago Police headquarters are located, in this neighborhood, right? And so, like a block from where we want to first install is where well, they probably drive there, but nevertheless, there's a huge parking lot across the street from where I want to sort of go. The former Illinois 8th Armory is now the Chicago Military Academy, a Chicago public school that has a military focus to it, right? And so there's a lot of people around there that I would love to see these markers, right? And so that maybe ties together your question. There were some black police officers, very few, but famously, when the black police officer in July 1919, not the black, but a black police officer, tried to arrest the man accused of killing this black boy, the white police wouldn't allow this black man to arrest a white accused person, and that was, again, part of the spark, right? And so black police existed. They generally didn't have the ability to sort of punish white people, right? In the same way that black soldiers couldn't ever tell white soldiers what to do, so they always had to be lower in rank, you know? And, yeah.
How did you manage to get the stone marker for Fritz Neubauer from Germany?
Well, so that one was essentially botched, right? Like, and so I know the people who created this project because I reached out to them, having spent a lot of time now in Berlin, right? And so I visited with some of the workers. I've met the artist, but I also met the guy who does the metalwork, right? And so I visited his studio in Berlin, and he gave me one that they weren't going to use because the inscription was messed up, right? And so it's just a random sort of name, but that wasn't going to be used, right? And so they gave me one so that I can come back to the U.S. and go, because actually there's some Americans who are familiar with this project who have had time to spend in Germany or other countries and might have seen them. But most of us have never heard of this, right? Like, and so having a prop is nice. And so, especially because Skokie's a dangerous place, right? So I've got this weapon, right, to defend myself against. So I carried it back on the plane, and this summer when I carried it back last August, it was in my checked luggage because I was worried about the weight of my. It was not in my check, it was in my carry-on because I was worried about the weight of my check luggage. And then I'm like saving 5 pounds, but I'm going, oh, and they started pulling this out at every security checkpoint. They're like, what is this? And I'm like, oh, it's a weapon, actually. You know, I thought of it's art, but in fact, you could use this to hurt somebody. Luckily, I was able to talk my way through 3 different checkpoints along the way because I didn't want it to be confiscated, right? Like, so it was given to me by the Stolpersteiner team, if you will, in Berlin. Yeah.
Thanks. I think that'll be our last question.
Do you get any pushback from the black community on the South Side to a white professor coming into their neighborhood and talking about an ugly piece of their history? And then on the flip side of that, are you making efforts to bring black people into your activity?
So those are great questions, and they're important questions. I'm mindful of being perceived as an outsider for multiple different reasons. I'm not even a Chicagoan full-time, right? Like, in addition to not being a black person, right? In addition to not living in some of these neighborhoods where the violence occurred, right? Like, and so I'm mindful of that. You know, the first thing I always say is that, you know, well, white people created racism, so white people should be taking the lead to fight against racism. But if that doesn't convince you, right? Like, what I do is the majority of the people on my team are African Americans and other people of color, right? Like, and so I think that's very important, right? Like, so trying to get people in these neighborhoods sympathetic to and on board is part of my efforts, right? Like, that I think is vital, you know, and so that is what I've tried to do, right? Like, so I spoke to a group at a Chicago Public Library on 48th in Michigan. That's a famous Southside library, like a month and a half ago, for instance, right? Like, and that audience was 100% African-American audience, right? Like, they are unfamiliar generally with this history, although there's some oral memory, like stories passed down. One man who's a pastor at a church who I met and I'm working with, he's like, my mother, he grew up in, like on Dearborn in the say 29th and Dearborn, right? And he's younger than me, he's 40 maybe. And he's like, my mother wouldn't let me go to that beach because she knew something had happened to a black boy in the past. His mother supposedly didn't know really what had happened, right? Like, but it's very interesting because my thought was that actually it's largely forgotten, and I think that's true. But in fact, there is some memory, right? Like within some families, right? And maybe not just black families, right? I can't say, but like and then I mentioned that specifically, this man, because as far as pushback goes, so like I've gotten zero pushback from people saying, why is a white guy, you know, once they hear a bit more, they're sort of excited generally when I've talked to African Americans across the city. However, I've gotten a little pushback from, really, you're going to sort of commemorate the white people who were killed? Now, I'm actually not yet committed to, I don't know what the future holds, right? Like, do we commemorate, because in fact we know some of the white people who were killed were probably victims, and we also know probably that some of the white people who were killed were bad guys, I'd say. Like, do we commemorate them? That's a great question, and I say I have no definitive answer yet, right? Like, but this black guy said, I don't think we should be putting markers for those people. And I can't disagree with him, and we all are entitled to our opinions, right? Like, he's actually someone I'm trying to work with in this neighborhood, so I'm especially interested in what he thinks. But like, you know, like I say, well, we're starting with some of the black folks, right? And I guess we move along, we'll see, right, how the project develops and what, in fact, people want, right? Like, because I keep saying we because I don't want this to be about me. But I think those things really matter, right? Like, and I think that we have to, you know, center those questions, right? Like, and so I've tried to as much as I'm able. Luckily, but it can be hard, right? Like to sort of come into a sort of a space where maybe you're the only white person saying, "Let me tell you about this and what I think we should do." And well, like not everyone wants to sign on to that, right? Like, but I've generally had incredibly positive responses from dozens and dozens of people in different scenarios, right? Like so far, right? Like, and I guess hopefully that'll continue. I think generally people see this as a sort of a positive, yeah.
Well, thank you very much.